Picture this. You're lying in your deathbed, your body failing you, piece by piece. Your skin is turning yellow, your organs are shutting down, and you can feel death creeping closer with every labored breath. But you're not just anyone, you're a king, and death is not an option. So you make a decision that will haunt history forever. You decide to drink liquid gold. What I'm about to tell you is the true story of King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, a ruler so desperate to cheat death that he literally consumed molten metal, believing it would grant him eternal life. Instead, it gave him one of the most horrifying deaths ever recorded in medieval history. And the worst part? He didn't die quickly. He melted from the inside out, over the course of weeks, while his court physicians watched in horror as their king's body became a living furnace. This is not just a story about royal madness, it's a tale of medieval alchemy gone wrong. Of a man who thought he could play God with his own mortality, and of what happens when desperation meets pseudoscience. In the most grotesque way possible, in the year 1419, King Wenceslaus IV ruled over Bohemia with an iron fist. But despite his power, despite his wealth, despite commanding armies and controlling the fate of thousands, there was one enemy he couldn't defeat: time itself. At 58 years old, the king was plagued by a mysterious illness that had been eating away at his body for months. His physicians were baffled. His skin had taken on a sickly pallor, his hair was falling out in clumps, and strange boils had begun appearing across his torso and limbs. But Wenceslaus was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He had survived political conspiracies, civil wars, and assassination attempts. He had crushed rebellions and expanded his kingdom's borders. Death, he believed, was simply another enemy to be conquered. And if traditional medicine couldn't save him, then he would turn to something more, unconventional. The king's obsession with immortality began with a book, a leather-bound tome written by a mysterious alchemist known only as Magister Aurelius, who claimed to have discovered the secret to eternal life. According to this text, gold, the most perfect and incorruptible of all metals, held the key to human immortality. The theory was simple. If gold never tarnished, never decayed, never aged, then consuming it would grant those same properties to the human body. But there was a catch. The gold couldn't be consumed in its solid form. It had to be transformed into what the alchemists called potable gold, liquid gold, that could be drunk like water. The process was incredibly dangerous and required heating gold to temperatures that could melt steel. Most alchemists who attempted it died in the process. Their laboratories reduced to ash and their bodies found charred beyond recognition. Wenceslaus didn't care about the risks. He assembled a team of the most skilled alchemists in Europe, promising them unimaginable wealth if they could create the elixir of immortality. He converted an entire wing of his castle into a massive laboratory filled with furnaces, crucibles, and apparatus that looked more like instruments of torture than scientific equipment. For months, the alchemists worked day and night, melting gold and mixing it with mercury, lead, and other toxic substances. The air in the laboratory became thick with poisonous fumes, and several assistants died from inhaling the toxic vapors. But the king pressed on, driven by his obsession with cheating death. Finally, after 6 months of failed experiments, the alchemists presented their king with a small vial of what appeared to be liquid sunlight. The molten gold had been mixed with mercury and dissolved in a solution of aqua regia, a combination of nitric and hydrochloric acid so powerful it could dissolve virtually any metal. The resulting liquid glowed with an otherworldly light and radiated heat even when cool to the touch. The head alchemist, a man named Heinrich von Wurzburg, begged the king to reconsider. He had seen what mercury poisoning could do to the human body, and he knew that drinking molten gold was essentially consuming liquid death. But Wenceslaus was beyond reason. His illness had progressed to the point where he could barely walk, and he believed this golden elixir was his only hope for survival. On the morning of August 15th, in the year 1419, King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia drank liquid gold. The moment the molten metal touched his lips, witnesses reported that his mouth began to smoke. The king's eyes went wide with shock and pain, but he forced himself to swallow the entire vial. According to the court physician's notes, the king's throat and esophagus were immediately cauterized by the superheated metal, and the smell of burning flesh filled the royal chambers. But the horror was just beginning. As the liquid gold traveled through the king's digestive system, it began to work like a slow-acting poison. The mercury in the solution attacked his nervous system, causing violent tremors and hallucinations. The gold particles settled in his organs, creating what medieval physicians described as internal fires that burned him from within. Within hours, the king's skin began to take on a golden hue. Not the healthy glow of someone with a tan, but a sickly, metallic coloration that made him look more like a statue than a living man. His body temperature soared to dangerous levels, and his skin became so hot to the touch that his servants had to wear gloves when attending to him. The king's court physician, a man named Johannes Huss, kept detailed notes of what happened next. According to his account, the king's internal organs began to shut down one by one. His liver, poisoned by the mercury, swelled to 3 times its normal size. His kidneys failed, causing his body to retain toxic fluids that made his skin stretch and crack like old leather. His lungs filled with fluid, making every breath a struggle. But the most horrifying aspect of the king's condition was what happened to his blood. The gold particles had somehow bonded with his red blood cells, turning his blood into a thick metallic substance that barely flowed through his veins. When the physicians attempted to bleed him, a common medical practice of the time, what came out was not blood, but a golden viscous fluid that hardened almost immediately upon contact with air. For 3 weeks, King Wenceslas lingered between life and death, his body slowly consuming itself from within. His skin began to peel away in sheets, revealing muscle tissue that had turned a sickly yellow color. His hair fell out completely, and his fingernails turned black and began to fall off. Most disturbing of all, his body began to emit a metallic odor so strong that servants had to burn incense constantly to mask the smell. The king's mental state deteriorated as rapidly as his physical condition. The mercury poisoning caused severe brain damage, leading to violent hallucinations and periods of complete delirium. He claimed to see golden serpents crawling under his skin and insisted that his organs were turning into precious metals. In his final days, he became convinced that the transformation was working, that he was becoming a golden god who would rule forever. On September 7, 1419, King Wenceslas IV died in agony. But even in death, his body continued to change. According to witnesses, his corpse maintained its golden color for days after his death. And when they finally prepared him for burial, his body was found to be significantly heavier than normal, as if the gold had indeed become part of his physical structure. The most disturbing discovery came during the embalming process. When the royal embalmers opened the king's body, they found that his internal organs had been completely transformed. His liver had hardened into something resembling metallic, or his heart had turned a deep bronze color, and his stomach contained what appeared to be nuggets of actual gold. The embalmers were so horrified by what they found that several of them fled the castle and never returned. But the story doesn't end with the king's death. In the days following his passing, strange events began occurring throughout the castle. Servants reported that the room where the king died remained unnaturally warm, even in the middle of winter. The walls seemed to shimmer with a golden light, and some claimed they could still smell the metallic odor of the king's final days. More disturbing still, several people who had been in close contact with the king during his final weeks began to show similar symptoms. His personal physician developed a golden rash that spread across his body, and 2 of his servants died from what appeared to be mercury poisoning. It was as if the king's transformation had somehow become contagious, spreading its curse to those who had tried to help him. The alchemists who had created the deadly elixir met fates that were equally gruesome. Heinrich von Wurzburg, the head alchemist, was found dead in his laboratory just days after the king's death. His body was discovered next to a crucible filled with molten gold, and investigators determined that he had either fallen into the furnace or deliberately thrown himself into it. The other alchemists simply vanished, leaving behind only their abandoned equipment and notes, written in codes that scholars are still trying to decipher today. King Wenceslas was buried in a coffin, sealed with wax and buried deeper than any other royal grave in Bohemian history. The official cause of death was listed as divine punishment for dabbling in dark arts, but the real cause was clear to anyone who had witnessed his final weeks. He had literally poisoned himself with liquid metal in a desperate attempt to achieve immortality. The story of King Wenceslas and his golden death became a cautionary tale that spread throughout medieval Europe. It served as a warning about the dangers of alchemy and the folly of trying to cheat death through unnatural means. But it also revealed something darker about human nature, our willingness to risk everything, even our own lives, in pursuit of the impossible. What makes this story even more tragic is that modern science has revealed exactly what happened to the king's body. When gold is heated to extreme temperatures and mixed with mercury, it creates a compound that is incredibly toxic to human tissue. The mercury attacks the nervous system and organs, while the gold particles act like microscopic razors, cutting through tissue and blood vessels. The combination is essentially a recipe for one of the most painful deaths imaginable. The king's golden skin color was the result of a condition called chrysiasis, which occurs when gold particles accumulate in the body's tissues. His internal organs had been literally cooked by the superheated metal, and the golden nuggets found in his stomach were likely the result of the metal cooling and solidifying inside his body. In essence, King Wenceslas had turned himself into a human furnace, cooking himself from the inside out. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story is how it reflects the desperate lengths to which people will go to avoid death. King Wenceslas had everything a person could want: power, wealth, luxury, but none of it could protect him from the one thing that comes for everyone, eventually. His story serves as a reminder that no amount of money or power can buy immortality, and that sometimes the cure can be far worse than the disease. In the end, King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia got his wish in the most twisted way possible. He did achieve a form of immortality, not through his golden elixir, but through his story, which has been passed down through the centuries as one of history's most horrifying examples of human folly. His tale continues to be told, not as a celebration of his life, but as a warning about the dangers of playing with forces beyond our understanding. The next time you see gold, jewelry, or coins, remember the story of the king who thought he could drink his way to eternal life. Remember that sometimes the most precious things in life can also be the most deadly, and that the pursuit of immortality can lead to a fate worse than death itself. Because in the end, King Wenceslas didn't just die, he melted from within, consumed by his own desperate ambition and the very metal he thought would save him. And somewhere in a forgotten corner of a Bohemian cemetery, sealed in a lead coffin and buried deeper than any other grave, lies the golden corpse of a king who learned too late that some prices are simply too high to pay, even for a crown.